And I found there was a bill from the early 1900s. We don't do bills like that anymore. This said, if you touch government property, statues, monuments of any kind, you will serve 10 years with no probation, no early getting out. You go to jail for 10 years. Very simple. It was beautifully stated. It was like one paragraph. And it had dust on it. It was dusty. Nobody used it because we wouldn't do that because we become very soft. They only go after political opponents. They don't do anything like murderers. Those guys are safe. Drug dealers, no problem. But political opponents, they go after. So this was in very bad. It was a very old bill. And I had a news conference, and they were all over that. They wanted to take down the Jefferson Memorial. They wanted to take it down. They were heading that way. They were actually heading that way. We had them all stopped, but they were heading that way. It's like fighting a war. And I went out to a news conference. I announced anybody that touches any of our monuments or statues goes to jail for 10 years. Everybody left Washington, D.C. I was very lonely.
Dara Starr Tucker, so great to have you on the show. For those who haven't met Dara yet, she hosts the All Over the Place podcast, one of the best political podcast shows out there. And I really wanted her take on this latest from former President Trump. You know, when we hear Make America Great Again, we always assume that he wants to take us back to the 50s, but going back to the 1900s is a altogether different proposition. What do you make of this?
It's completely unsurprising, I guess. After the Charlottesville rallies, we kind of saw him start to cozy up to these folks around this Southern heritage and Confederate heritage and these monuments and, all of this. And it's not like, this dude from New York is really all that personally connected to any of this or has any personal stake in it at all. But I think he obviously knows that going down this road is something that will engender support from that particular group of people. So he's an opportunist, and he's doing what's necessary to get him into the good graces of a group of people whose votes he needs.
Is it fair to call this a dog whistle anymore? I mean, it's too loud. It's too obvious. I don't think I wouldn't call it a dog whistle at all. And the irony of all of it is that when you hear Trump speak about these monuments, he tends to group all of the founding fathers in with a lot of these Confederate heroes whose statues that are worthy of retaining, according to him. So he's lumping in George Washington with Thomas Jefferson and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. It's like he doesn't even really have enough of a sense of the history to understand how maintaining a statue of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, and who both have complicated histories, obviously, would be different than having a statue of a Confederate hero in the Capitol. He literally does not make a distinction. And so I think he just tends to put his foot in it when he talks about this stuff because he is so obviously ignorant of history. So I think for someone else, it might be a dog whistle. For him, I think it's just a really clumsy attempt to appeal to a demographic whose votes he's looking to secure. That's a really good point because I just assumed this was cynical politics and trying to rile up the racist segment of his base, but in a real way, he doesn't know better. He doesn't know the difference between Jefferson and Jackson and Lee. And, as a kid who grew up in Alabama, at least graduated from public high school in Alabama, I mean, we knew the difference between Stonewall Jackson and Nathan Bedford Forrest, founder of the KKK, right, and the founding fathers, who, as you put it, have their own issues to grapple with. But, Stone Mountain in Georgia is offensive on every level. And,
right,
and we were taught the difference between that and the Jefferson Memorial or the Washington Monument.
Yeah, I think he loves, he's a, stirrer anyway, but I think he likes stoking concerns and fears that
these crazy kids, these crazy protesters, the woke left or whatever, they're just coming after American history in general. They just want to erase it all. Well, these people were slave holders, and so we just have to get rid of them. And so to not draw any lines and to not make any distinctions between these people, I mean, it serves the narrative. It serves a narrative on his part, but I think it also speaks to genuine ignorance, because I truly think he doesn't know the history.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have two favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support. Enlighten us about the broad history of the campaign to memorialize the lost cause, because it's not as if in the Deep South, immediately after the Civil War, there was this nostalgia, this reminiscence, this celebration of that cause. That was a political act starting kind of in the teens and 20s to push back against the nascent civil rights movement.
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people assume, well, these statues, these monuments have been here forever. And the majority of them haven't. The majority of them started to pop up with the resurgence, that kind of second resurgence of the KKK in the teens and 20s, as you said. And a lot of it was a pushback against kind of this rising. There was a group of Black folks that called themselves the new Negroes. And I put that in quotes, that W.B. Du Bois generation, in the teens and 20s, that was really rising up and saying, hey, we're not going to be treated like our forefathers, like our parents and grandparents. And this is a new generation that had absolutely no attachment to slavery. So they were really rising up in this era. And then you saw the pushback, the backlash from the KKK. And so before that, all of the monuments and the statues really existed in cemeteries. They were modest. They were not necessarily attempting to venerate these people. They were attempting to memorialize them, as you would expect war, the war dead to be memorialized in very normal ways. And it was usually, societies for the, Confederate preservation of, Confederate history or whatever. But yeah, in the 19-teens and 20s, you saw just a huge influx of these monuments and statues being put up, and just gaudy, massive things. And suddenly all of this money being raised and put into creating this sort of romanticized vision of Confederate history. And then, of course, Birth of a Nation came out at that time, 1915, and was screened in the White House. And then with the modern civil rights movement in the late 40s and 50s, really going into the mid 1960s, that's when you saw the next resurgence of a lot of these monuments being built. So people assume these things are, 150 years old or something. And they're not, and a lot of them really have actually been built in the last 20 or 30 years. A lot of them have been built by the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And, now we've got the flaggers putting up these huge Confederate flags off of freeways. And this is a very intentional effort to kind of push back against so-called Black liberation. And so I think, most people don't understand how moneyed that whole world is and how intentional this narrative that they are creating is. I certainly don't think Trump has any, connection to any of that.
No, I don't think he understands any of the nuance, but I think he has an animal instinct for the politics of it, if not the history of it. Because those monuments, the vast majority, are political in nature. They're not historical. They're making a political statement, pushing back, exactly as you said, against Black liberation and the civil rights movement. What do you say to those who argue that, look, Donald Trump just spouts off. He never actually gets policy enacted. He doesn't care about policy. He'll move on to the next so-called culture war issue. Stop getting so upset about speeches like this.
Well, no, I don't think Donald Trump really understands a lot about how to work with the legislative branch to govern, as the legislative branch was meant to work in cooperation with the executive branch. So now I would agree with that, but I know that he signed an executive order in the summer of 2020 when all of the protests were popping off with George Floyd being killed, and people were starting to attack the Confederate statues. I know that he signed an executive order saying that anyone who defaced a public statue would get 10 years in prison. And there were already statutes that existed around that anyway, but he went out of his way to sign an executive order that said, if you mess with these statues, that's automatically 10 years in prison. So, I believe he is about action in that area. If it's going to appease his base, of course he is. I think we should believe, that he is willing to take action on it, even if it's just signing an executive order for a law that already exists, that's already on the books. But just the public facing part of that is very important to him, And so, yeah, I believe that he says he'll do what he says he'll do.
Yeah, me too. I dismiss that the excuse just outright, like the excuse that he doesn't get things done. Actually, the president has enormous executive power, especially when you look at his emergency powers, which Project 2025 has said that, he should be ready to invoke on day one, Insurrection Act, things like that. And that should really, really terrify us. Let's end on a slightly more positive note. What's your take a week and a half out from the DNC about how it went down? By the way, great seeing you there. What a week. What an experience. I felt like we were turning a generational page in American politics, at least turning the page on the better part of a decade of fear and divisiveness and anger. And it was really a week of optimism and joy and hope. And it's about damn time.
Yeah. I'm still kind of processing through my time at the DNC. I have a lot of thoughts. I just put up kind of a video essay on all my social media platforms. So if you care to check that out, I have a lot of conflicted feelings about it. I mean, obviously, as a Black woman, kind of watching this historic moment was incredible for me. But there happened to be a couple of Republican dudes sitting right behind me who were kind of heckling the entire evening. And so, that it just sort of, and I thought, well, maybe there's a reason for this. Maybe there's a reason that I ended up, because the place, as you know, it was absolutely packed. It was hard to get a seat by about 7:00. And so I was, considering myself super lucky to even be able to get in there for the speech. And then I ended up sitting in front of these two dudes. So I was grappling with a lot that night, the actual night of Kamala Harris's speech. But being there and watching, the through line, I keep commenting on just even being in the room and watching the delegates casting their votes and thinking, this is a moment historically that is tied to something that began, as we're sitting here talking about, history and these historical factors that are still at play. This is a process that began 250 years ago. We are part of a continuum that was started by a bunch of old white dudes that are long gone, but somehow that structure that they put in place and that aspiration that they had for this more perfect union, we are still in the process of attempting at least to find the correct and the proper expression of that in 2024. And our republic is still holding. It feels a little bit tenuous at times, but we're still holding on to it. And it really infused me with a lot of expectation and with a lot of hope, with a lot of joy, as you said, even in spite of all of the conflicted feelings I had about, Palestinian voices not being heard at the convention. And, concerns that I have about maybe casting too broad a tent. Are we working too hard on bringing in some of these right-leaning folks? Is this really going to change the core makeup of the party? So I have my concerns, and I try to view all of that very sober-mindedly, while at the same time really understanding the historical context of what we were able to witness, and really believing in my heart, we can do this. Yeah. We can, as you said, turn the page. It is possible for us to finally move past this era of Trump. Now, what comes after it, I don't know, but I believe we are able to turn the page.
Yeah, I do too. And I love your framing. It's evocative of Vice President Harris's line about, the greatest story ever told. And we're still writing it. And for me, that was
Right.
the most significant takeaway from the convention. I mean, the speeches were great. Some of the policy prescriptions were great, but the idea that patriotism is about trying to make your country live up to its promises, not some
Yes.
backward looking statue centered nostalgia,
Yeah.
right? That
Some fantasy, some romanticism of
exactly.
something that didn't exist or shouldn't have existed. But what can we actually celebrate the aspirational nature of
That's right.
what we're really going for here?
Yep,
Yeah,
that's it. Dara, great having you on. Let's do it again soon. Thanks for joining us.
I would love to, Ken. Thank you so much for having me.